There are three parts to the flute: the head joint, which we'll talk about in a moment in greater detail, the middle joint, which houses the majority of the key mechanism of the instrument, and the foot joint. Before we put the instrument together, I want to talk just briefly about how to find a quality instrument and the importance of having a working instrument. If your instrument is in ill repair or isn't functioning properly, then your success will be limited or hindered. So you want to make sure that when you get your first flute, that it's an instrument that's going to play well for you and respond well. When you're looking for a quality instrument, you want to make sure that you're finding an instrument that has pads that are going to seal properly. If you glance down this flute, you can kind of look underneath the keys to see the pads, and for the most part they look fairly clean. There are no torn pads, there's no gunk or mold growing on the pads. This other instrument, which may have been in someone's closet for a while, if you look at the pads, you see that some of them are kind of worn, and there's actually maybe even a little bit of mold growing on the pad. So if I were to purchase this instrument, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but I might want to consider having the pads replaced. Having the pads seal is the number one thing that's going to contribute to your experience of success as a flutist. If the pads are not sealing, you'll experience an airy tone, a lack in response. It's just going to create more frustration. So you want to make sure you have an instrument in which the pads seal. Another thing to consider when looking for an instrument is the cork in the head joint. So the head joint basically consists of a tube, a lip plate, a crown, and a cork. There are four primary parts to the head joint. In this head joint, which is I'll talk about later at some point, a really fun one, the cork is very, very tight. You can check the cork by taking your tuning rod. This should be located in your case. It might be wood, it might be made of metal, but it has a little notch on one end. Insert the tuning rod into the head joint, and you want that notch to be right in the middle of the embouchure hole in the lip plate. That's the best placement for the cork that's inside the tubing. If you press a little bit, if you push in, the cork shouldn't move. That means that the cork is sealing tightly. Again, this idea of having a tight seal in your instrument, whether it's the cork or whether it's the pads, is really, really important. If the cork is leaking, your instrument won't respond as well. It will produce an airiness of tone and can also affect intonation. So the cork sealing is really important. So I'll show you an example of an instrument where the cork isn't sealing. So I'm inserting my tuning rod in. I'm looking, and the notch on the tuning rod is actually really high. I'm going to push in just to see what happens. Woo! The cork comes right out of the top. That's really scary. So that means that this cork isn't sealing at all. You may read, or you may have a teacher tell you that you can soak the cork and have it absorb some water and then put it back into the flute. That's a really, really temporary solution. If your cork does something like this, you need to have it replaced. It's a really inexpensive repair, and it's going to really contribute to your success on the instrument. So make sure that you have a working cork. If your cork does do something like this, you'll need to, and if you do decide to soak it, please, please, please do not pull it out through the top of the head joint. The head joint is what we define as tapered. That means that it's slightly narrower at the top than it is at the bottom. If you pull the cork through the smaller end, you can actually damage the head joint. So if you want to pop the cork out, you need to push it down and out. So as mentioned, on this head joint, the line on the tuning rod was slightly toward the crown in the head joint. Ideally, we want that line to be right in the center of the embouchure hole. So the way to lower it, or to lower the cork, is to gently unscrew the crown and then press it in. And then you check the line again. I still have a ways to go. So I'm unscrewing the crown and I'm pushing it again, and I check almost to center. I just need a little bit more. There we go. So the line's right in the center. If it's the opposite, if the line is too far toward the open end of the head joint, something like this, then you'll actually have to, if you have a tight sealing cork, use a little bit of muscle to press your tuning rod up into the cork, to move the cork up into the head joint. You'll want to do this with sensitivity and a gentle but firm pressure. But again, ideally, we want that line on the tuning rod to be centered right in the embouchure hole. Let's take just a moment also to talk about dents in the instrument. If you come across a flute, it seems like a bargain, but it has some dents in it. Where those dents are will determine whether or not it's going to be a good instrument for you. For example, this flute has a small dent here on the tubing. This isn't going to have much of an effect, if any, on the way that the instrument plays. It's more of an aesthetic consideration. It may not look as pretty as one that doesn't have a dent, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to serve you well as a beginning model flute. If, however, you have a dent that goes into a tone hole, that could be a real issue because, again, that's going to affect how the pads seal and how the instrument responds. So dents aren't a horrible thing. The flute can be prettier if it doesn't have dents, but the important thing is whether or not those dents are located on a tone hole. If you decide to purchase a flute, there are many, many options available today. Some of the most common considerations are inline versus offset G. My flute has an offset G. That's this key right here. So if you look at the line of keys, you'll see that these are in line, and then all of a sudden, this G and G sharp key are offset. They're not in line. And then the keys, starting with the F sharp key and all the way down, are back in line with the keys at the top. This is becoming more and more fashionable in the flute world. When I was growing up, and I won't tell you when that was, inline flutes were very fashionable. So that meant that these two keys that were offset were actually in line. But that can create some issues with hand position, particularly if you have petite hands. Having that offset G, once we begin working with the hand position and playing position of the instrument, facilitates the ease of technique. It brings those keys closer to the ring and the middle finger. With an inline flute, you'll have to reach further with the ring finger and with the pinky finger. So I highly recommend an offset G unless you're someone with incredibly long spider-like fingers. Otherwise, offset is best. Another consideration that you'll be able to make is regarding the foot joint, whether your foot joint comes with a low B or a low C. You'll see that the low B foot is longer and contains one extra key than the low C foot joint. As a beginning flutist, you probably won't be playing a lot of low Bs. If you're playing second flute in the New World Symphony professionally, you'll need a low B. There are very few pieces, very little repertoire that requires a low B. However, the addition of the length of the tubing here does have an effect on the overall response, intonation, and resonance of the instrument. So my preference is for a low B foot. But having a low C foot joint is just fine too. So if you're purchasing an instrument, I'd go ahead and get the low B. It's not going to cost you anymore. But if you find an instrument to use that has a low C and it's a great deal, by all means, feel free to use it. Other considerations are open hole versus closed hole flutes. So my flute here is what is known as open hole. So if you look at these 5 keys, you'll see that they're rings with holes in the middle. On the other flute here, this is a closed hole flute. So all of the key work is closed. Those vents aren't there. A closed hole flute is preferable for someone who has very, very petite fingers, for small hands, where covering the holes might be a little bit of an issue. It's more important as a beginner to develop a sense of relaxed finger technique than to strain in order to cover the holes. That's my own personal recommendation regarding open hole flutes. An open hole flute will, however, as you progress, allow opportunities for special fingerings, for venting certain notes in ways to aid with intonation, and it will also help facilitate some extended techniques that are required more and more in our flute repertoire, even in a lot of ensemble repertoire, particularly band repertoire. So the open hole flute may be a little more resonant because of the venting system, the way that the vents work with the open holes. Closed hole is better for someone with really, really petite hands to encourage a relaxed playing position. The last consideration is the type of material that your flute is made of. A lot of flutes today are made of silver, which is a really hardy, sturdy instrument. I think it's quite funny that Boehm, the person who invented the mechanism that we play with, the key system that we play on, loved having a silver flute versus a wooden flute, because he could put it in his case and he wouldn't have to take it out again for months. Which I think is just hilarious. I hope that isn't the case with you. I hope that you'll take your flute out every day. But silver doesn't need a lot of maintenance like older wooden flutes did. You would have to oil them and take care of them very regularly. But silver doesn't require that. It's really, really sturdy. It has a brilliant sound. The other materials that you'll potentially be able to consider are nickel. Nickel is a lot cheaper than silver, so if you're on a budget, nickel will work just fine. Silver is more expensive, it's a little heavier, and if you wanted to, you could even consider gold and platinum. Wouldn't recommend it for a beginner. Wait until you get that job as principal flutist in an orchestra, and then you can go for gold or platinum. And I think that's about it.